The end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century brings a dizzying array of avant-garde artistic movements. Each has its own distinct style, purpose, values. As we navigate this bewildering variety of avant-gardes, we rely on three essential terms: Expressionism, Primitivism, Abstraction. All three are notoriously difficult to define in a crisp way, but they are essential tools for coming at the art. So we have to ask, what are these terms pointing to in the art and the intentions that will be visible in the art? We can consult Merriam-Webster to get a dictionary definition. Expressionism, a theory or practice in art of seeking to depict the subjective emotions and responses that objects and events arouse in the artist. Or we can let Van Gogh define it for us. His comment, instead of trying to reproduce exactly what I have before my eyes, I use color more arbitrarily in order to express myself more forcibly. So he's not concerned with the objective appearance of cypress trees, the village, the skies, the stars. Instead, he's emphasizing the expressive force of each artistic choice, the pulsing weave of strokes, the tension between the golden disk and the silver light, the deep blue and the bright, bright yellow, the way light and shadow swim in currents. Emotion can mean, or feeling, expressing feeling can mean emotions that we know how to name, such as sadness or happiness, joy or fear, but it can also mean things like a kinds of energy, a kind of agitation, or a kind of bliss, a kind of heightened intensity. So in Van Gogh, landscape is a stimulus to a kind of fever of sensation and feeling. We have a landscape animated by spiritual intensity, which is communicated through what we could call the expressive elements of painting itself, color, brushwork, which are being used free from the job of imitating appearances. The sky doesn't really look this amazing pale jade green. This is an expressive choice. With Van Gogh exploiting the power of blue and yellow combined, making green. So the blue of what we normally think of the sky with yellow, that intense golden heat of the sun, becoming this shimmering green. So we will see that when we look at artists like André Derain working in what's called fauvism, really making the expressive potential of color, brushstroke, fluid, curving, writhing line, all of that become the main point of the painting, more so than the look of mountains or the kind of tree, whether this is an olive tree or something else. It doesn't really matter so much as the red of the trunks and the purple dots that form the path. And some forms of expressionism will indeed emphasize psychological states of mind and often extreme emotions. When we get art like Edvard Munch in his The Scream of 1893, expressing the inner world rather than the outer experience of things in order to conjure up a state of mind. This is what we mean by a turn toward subjective experience. And the entire landscape here, which bleeds and pours and engulfs the figure, reduced to an expression of anguish, that entire landscape exists as an extension of his state of mind, not as a place that we could find in the real world. This turn toward the subjective interior of the artist is a big part of symbolism, right? So the expressionism of psychology, fantasy, nightmares and dreams, all of this appears in Redon's The Eye, like a strange balloon moves toward infinity. This eyeball with its lashes hovering in a balloon, and the spider. This is all going to be something that you see further developed in the 20th century in surrealism. in the 1920s. So we're establishing some continuities here. Symbolism and Expressionism as movements are interested in the interior states of fantasy and feeling, and they visualize that through often illogical, exaggerated, or distorted forms to express powerful instincts, disturbing urges, troubling emotions. We can see that with the gnarled hands, the faces, the postures and gestures of Rodin's figures. We have looked primarily at painting, which for many different kinds of reasons was sort of the primary arena for avant-garde art making, but sculpture is certainly part of that in Rodin's time and also increasingly prominently in the 20th century. We should think about this interest in intense emotions in relation to the fact that this is the time period when the field of psychoanalysis is being born, when Charcot, shown here, is giving lectures to students who include a guy named Sigmund Freud about what was called hysteria. And these studies, these clinical studies, had a kind of a sex and gender division to them, in which the hysteria was deemed to be part of the psycho-affliction of female patients, and male scientists, clinicians, were naming it, describing it, defining it. So there is a growing interest in the psychological makeup of the human mind and in psychological afflictions, how to analyze them, how to study them, how to treat them. And artists are giving us the human face and human identity made strange through expressive means. We'll see this in 1911 with Emile Nolde's masks. His masks can also be understood in terms of the other important term that we need to be able to use, primitivism, a fascination with what was called the primitive, which is in quotes because this label was often applied to other cultures, non-Western cultures, that were deemed primitive when in fact they were profoundly sophisticated cultures that have their own accomplished traditions in art and thought and are not primitive at all. The primitive was not meant as a derogatory term, though. It was, even though there was certainly racism in the way European artists applied it to non-Western cultures. But we will see that it has to do with the essence of human experience, the essence of the human mind and body, of human life and human art. It is, in a sense, a reaction to the industrialization that is represented in the Eiffel Tower, the cult of technological progress. It is a response to that looks for the kinds of spiritual and communal values that seem to have been lost or becoming lost in the age of the machine. One very famous definition of modernity is that it is the disenchantment of the world, meaning that our experience of the world as a place of magic, drenched in spiritual power, of spiritual forces having access to us, guiding us, that this was obliterated through science. And you could talk about a lot of this art as a search for an enchanted elsewhere, a search for what kinds of qualities of magic and communal life had seemed to be disappeared in the industrialized West. Paul Gauguin is absolutely on that search when he goes to Tahiti and paints in response to Tahitian culture. He is interested in primitivism, a belief in the value of what is simple and unsophisticated, expressed as a philosophy of life or through art and literature. So he is looking for a simpler life way, and he is completely misunderstanding Tahitian culture. It is not unsophisticated. He's projecting his own desires for a kind of paradise world of sensuality, of quiet communion with nature and spiritual forces. And in reality, he was actually exploiting Tahitians. He was sexually exploiting 14-year-old Tahitian girls. But his legacy is an idea that art will be a source of spiritual replenishment. Gauguin wasn't just looking for that kind of simplicity and purity of the so-called primitive in Tahiti. He also looked for it in France, in parts of France that had pockets of more ancient cultural lifeways, like in Breton, where you see that the people still wear wooden shoes, old-fashioned bonnets. And he famously starts thinking about subjectivity and primitivism together in his painting Vision After the Sermon, which is a painting of Jacob wrestling the angel, but in reality it's a painting of the minds of the women praying. The field of red is meant to be a symbolic field of spiritual intensity, not something that is literally visible in the objective world. Here's a very important quote that he gives us. An artist should not copy nature too much. Don't make your painting look too much like things. Is sand pink? It doesn't matter. There's something more important than making sand look like sand. Art is an abstraction. Derive this abstraction from nature while dreaming before it. But think more of creating than the actual result. To abstract from nature while dreaming before it is very much what artists increasingly are doing. And abstraction is our third key term. If we look back at Merriam-Webster, abstract, adjective, it's a somewhat slippery term. We'll have to pay close attention. Disassociated from any specific instance. So not specific, not particular. Difficult to understand. Well, you'll say that when you look at some of the paintings. Expressing a quality apart from an object. The word poem is concrete, a poem, a specific thing. Poetry, that's an abstract concept. It's much more conceptual than physical. And here we can see the definition that's reserved for art because of this time period we're studying, having only intrinsic form with little or no attempt at pictorial representation or narrative content. So less and less particulars, less and less concrete details, getting further and further away from narrative or pictorial representation. We will see that with Paul Cézanne. We can still recognize a mountain. We can infer that this green and yellow is some kind of a landscape, but we can hardly tell what is tree, what is building, except for a few strokes, daubs, touches of paint. We start to see the abstract qualities of the paint itself flickering across the surface. This will get even wilder when we look at the invention of Cubism, which is an offshoot of what Cézanne is up to, and then we'll get to see Kandinsky painting a painting that is a painting, but not a painting of. Not a painting of a landscape, not a painting of human figures or still life. This is an improvisation. This is color, strokes, forms, playing, called an improvisation like music. It is treating the color as various notes to be in play with each other. Music doesn't have to represent something. And we will look at Malevich getting this far with abstraction that absolutely this is utterly devoid of the contingent, the particular, the specific. He's, just as we heard the definition, poetry is concrete, a poem is abstract. We could say that a painting of something is concrete, but this is painting in the abstract. So as we watch the proliferation of different isms, different avant-gardes, Fauvism, Cubism, Orphism, Suprematism, on and on, Surrealism, notice that we are getting massive amounts of experimentalism that is more and more radical to the point of thoroughly rejecting the received conventions of what art even is, and asserting art's independent expressive means, color, brushstroke, material. This is what we will be discussing.